Hello and welcome to Retro 48K. Now if I was to say to you Squaresoft and the 90s, I'm willing to bet the first things you think of is going to be classic JRPGs, you know, your Final Fantasy 7s, your Chrono Triggers, games like that. What you might not think of is some excellent fighters, and as I said in my Tobal #1 review, you'd be really missing out on something if you didn't play these. So what I'm going to talk about today is the classic Bushido Blade, which is probably one of the most unique fighting games I've ever played, either before or since, and it kind of sums up this era of gaming for me, in that it was a time when developers could take risks, they could try something completely different because the stakes weren't that high, you know. It didn't cost £200 million to make these games, so they could get the odd one wrong and still crack on. But with that all being said, is it just a unique gem, or is it something that's still worth playing today? Well, join me as I review Bushido Blade on the Sony PlayStation and find out, is it actually still worth playing today? So what makes this game so unique? Because on the surface it just looks like a general weapons based fighter. You've got 6 characters and each one of those can pick from a variety of weapons, and the weapons themselves actually change your movement characteristics. Your moves aren't really based on the person you pick, they're more based on the weapon you pick that changes your fighting style. And each character has different stats that will affect how they use weapons, so the big beefy guys can handle the sledgehammer better than the smaller characters can. But that's not really what makes it unique. What makes it unique is the body damage system. So the developers lightweight quarters are actually wanting to create a game that simulated the tension of real combat. So in this you won't find any rounds or timers or health bars. This is a one-hit kill pretty much fighting system. So if you get a hit on the head or body, the majority of the time that will kill your opponent outright. You can even wound arms and legs if you hit them right, so that they can only use a sword one-handed or they're down on one leg, and it can lead to some pretty hilarious situations where you've wounded both the character's legs and they're just lying on the floor waving a sword at you. But it does provide what the developer originally wanted, and that's that tension of combat. Because you can die at any moment, you and your opponent, it means that fights are very much feint and counter feint. You're looking for that opening. It doesn't always benefit you to go wildly on the attack and just start swinging, and it does take a while to get used to that and learn what you should be doing on this game. You're looking for openings, you are not just going, it's not a Street Fighter with a rushdown character where you're charging in and just firing a combo. This is much more controlled and tense combat. To go along with that, they had to create a control scheme that matches it. So like I said before, this isn't a Street Fighter game or a Mortal Kombat game where you're doing ridiculously long combos or anything like that. This is they try to do a much more fluid approach, and moves try to lead in from one to the other, and to suit that you've got actually 3 different stances in the controls. You've got upper, middle and lower, and each one of those will change your move sets as well as change some of the characteristics. So normally you just have a high, medium, low attack in each of those stances as well, but going into a high posture and doing a high attack might give you much more reach, but the high posture might be harder to block your opponent and things like that. So there's lots of sort of rock, paper, scissors elements to the combat there that really fits together nicely and just knits together. But it is very slow paced, and if you're used to the likes of Tekken and Virtua Fighter and those action orientated fighting games, which sounds like a weird phrase to say because most fighting games are action orientated, but if you are used to that style of play, it can be very off-putting, and I think it's one of the key reasons why a lot of people have looked at this and just seen it as being slow and clunky. And the other side of that is you can actually fully explore the environments in this. I'll come on to that in a bit more in a minute, but you hold down a button and you can then move off. And again, the controls, because it's early 3D, doesn't quite work as well as you would like. There's no sort of dual analog control for the camera on this. You've got to wait for the camera to sort itself out and that kind of thing. So it is very much a victim of its time in that sense. I just mentioned you've got free movement around the environment, and that's for another unique feature of this one, in that Each character, other than the bosses, don't have their own arenas that you fight in. It's kind of an arena fighter to a certain extent, but the entire game is set in one big castle, and you can move that fight anywhere. The story goes that you are an assassin escaping your clan of assassins, and they're on the hunt for you. And depending on which character you pick, the reasons for your escape and the reasons for people trying to stop you changes based on that. But again, it's all set in that one castle, and it really just helps with the atmosphere. And I think the limitations of the PlayStation actually feed into this. So it's set at night with the snow falling on. There's actually some different times of day depending on what you do, but there's different times of day, and it just, because of that low draw distance, it adds either at night just the darkness, or during the day there's a sort of white haze, and it just really helps sell that atmosphere with wolves howling in the background, very little music, and just focus on that combat. Really well done. And if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you know I love my atmospheres in games, and I think it really helps. Where it doesn't help is in terms of the technical limitations of the PlayStation, is that sometimes you will want to move the fight to another area, so you'll set off to run, and you can only go so far, and then you've got to get the computer to follow you, and the next area won't load in until you're both within a certain, so if you're going through a tunnel, you both need to be within the last 10 feet of the tunnel, say, for it to load the next area in. And it can just feel a bit clunky as if you want to move the fight to a completely separate location, you're waiting for the computer to catch up. So it doesn't work as well as you would like it to. The other thing about the free movement is you have to be very careful about when you go back and engage them in fighting, because the game has an honour system. So this is Bushido, which has its own code of honour, the way of the warrior, and the game sort of weaves this into gameplay by having an honour system in itself. So if you fight dishonourably, if you throw sand in the opponent's face, if you hit them while they're bowing at the start of combat, or if you hit them while they're climbing up into an object, or stab them in the back or something like that, then you are seen as being dishonourable, and you won't get the true ending. You'll just get a you've been dishonourable ending. Each character has multiple endings based off what you do in the game, but the default one, if you're completely dishonourable, is just a blank screen basically with a bit of text on. If you want those classic PlayStation CG, you've got to stay honourable. And this is where, again, I think the Reach sort of extended what was technically capable at the time, because the honour system, while is genius in concept in terms of keeping that classic fighting that they wanted, in reality it can be difficult. There's no warning that you've done something dishonourable. So if you accidentally catch someone in the back for a swing because they've moved, or that maybe they've rolled back as you were lunging and you hit them in the back, that can be seen as dishonourable by the game, and you then get the worst ending. So if you're trying to get those good endings, it can be a bit frustrating, but you can use that free movement like I talked about in the castle mode to actually just skip a load of fights. You can actually just run up to where one of the cutscenes takes place, jump down a well and skip the fights. But again, like a lot of the systems in this, that honour system is genius in principle, but the execution's just limited by, I think, mainly the technology they had at the time. And that sums up a lot of the core features in this. The body damage system's the same in terms of, in principle, yeah, it's a great idea, but in actuality, because of the way the hitboxes are done, you can sometimes be hitting away at an opponent's head and it just doesn't register as a kill shot, or sometimes you'll slice their arm and it'll kill them. It can be really inconsistent in terms of what it counts at sometimes. I think it tries to benefit you more than the CPU, but it is very tricky to sort of get that balance right. In terms of overall package though in the game, you get quite a few modes in this. There's the general story mode, there's a point of view mode, which is basically a first person mode, which actually you can use as a system link and is great for multiplayer, so you can have two of yours if you've got two PlayStations and two copies of the game. And back in the day, two CRTs, it was very rarely used. There's also like a gauntlet mode where you go through enemy after enemy after enemy, trying to see how far you can get. And then there's the standard theatre where you can watch all the cutscenes. So as a full package, there is a lot there. But the big question is, does it still hold up today, and would I recommend you picking it out if you see it anywhere? The simple answer to that is I think yes, it's definitely worth picking up, but there are some caveats to that. So if you are the type of person that sort of early 3D really puts you off, and that clunkiness of the visuals, you know, despite the fact at the time this was quite a decent technical achievement, it hasn't aged as well as say Tobal number 1, because Tobal number 1 has a much more quirky art style that's aged better than this, where they've gone for as realistic as the PlayStation 1 could do, basically, and it hasn't aged all that great. Like I said, the controls are very early 3D era, where they were still working things out, and you didn't have dual analog sticks. So again, if you can put up with those, I really do think there's enough here to at least give it a go. It's one of those games, like I said at the start, that kind of really encompasses the era where devs would experiment on things with, because 3D was so new, different game types were emerging, different genres. Devs were trying things. It wasn't just here's another 2D fighter, here's another 3D fighter. The arena fighter was born and things like that. And this is that type of game in that type of era. It just sums it up perfectly. So if you can put up with a few quirks here and there and the slowness to the gameplay, I really do think it's worth going back to for its uniqueness alone. It's definitely worth a try, and it's not too expensive to pick up these days. But what do you guys think? I'd love to hear back from you. Did you pick it up back in the day? It was one of those that didn't sell brilliantly, so the sequel didn't come out in Europe or America, I don't believe. I think it was Japanese only. But did you pick it up, and what do you think of it? Or have you played it later? I'd love to hear from you. As always, I'm Retro48K, and I'll see you next time.